Around a decade ago, I founded a small tech startup. I put everything I had into it, my time, my savings. Years of nights where I didn't sleep more than 4 hours because there was always one more email, one more client call, one more fire to put out before morning. And slowly, it worked. The company grew into something real, something people in the industry actually respected. I used to drive past our office building at night just to look at the lit up windows on the third floor and think, I did that. Nobody gave me that. I built it. I didn't know yet that those were the last good years I'd have any real ownership over what I built. Because the people who eventually tried to take it from me weren't competitors. They weren't investors looking for a bigger cut. They were my own parents. And the person they handed my company to, the one they decided was more deserving of it than me, was my own sister. By the end of this, the same family that pushed me out of my own business ended up needing me more than I ever needed them. But if I start there, none of it is going to make sense. So I have to take you back further than that. Back before the company had a name, back before I even understood what a business plan was. Here's the part most people don't think about when they hear I started a company at 19. You can't just start a company at 19. Not legally, not really. I had no credit history, no collateral, no assets a bank would even glance at. When I tried to open a business account and lease a tiny shared office space, every single application asked for the same thing: a co-signer with an established financial history, someone the bank already trusted. I didn't have that. My father did. So the company went on paper under his name, his social security number on the registration, his signature on the lease. It was supposed to be temporary, a workaround, something we'd fix once I had enough revenue and credit of my own to transfer it cleanly into my name. That's what I told myself anyway. And for a while, it genuinely didn't matter because I was the one in the building every day. I was the one making every decision. I was the one whose name was on nothing official and everything that counted. At 21, when the company started actually making real money, I thought about asking my father to formally hand the ownership over to me. I drafted the conversation in my head a dozen times. But these were my parents, the two people I trusted more than anyone on earth. Asking felt almost insulting, like I was accusing them of something they hadn't done, so I never asked. I told myself there was time. I told myself trust was enough. I didn't know yet that the same trust I was so proud of was going to become the most expensive mistake of my life. Before I go any further, let me introduce myself. My name is Chelsea. I was born in Northern California, and I'm 29 years old right now. Everything I'm about to tell you happened over the better part of this last decade, and some of it still doesn't feel real to me, even after living through every second of it. Let's go back to where this actually starts, because the company wasn't the beginning. The beginning was a lot smaller and a lot hungrier than that. Growing up, money was never something we talked about casually in my house. It was the thing that decided everything. Whether the heat stayed on past February, whether dinner was actually dinner or just whatever could stretch across 4 plates. I remember being maybe 11 years old and watching my mother quietly portion out rice so my dad wouldn't notice there wasn't enough for seconds, because he worked the longer shift and she didn't want him going to bed hungry on top of exhausted. There were nights, more than I'd like to admit, where Sarah and I went to bed without eating. Not because anyone was being cruel about it. There just wasn't enough. My parents would tell us they'd already eaten earlier, which even as a kid I somehow understood was a lie meant to make us feel better about eating less. I never called them out on it. I just remember lying in bed with my stomach making noise and staring at the ceiling, doing math in my head about how many more years it would take before things felt different. The one person who always made those nights bearable was my grandmother. She lived 2 streets over, and she had this habit of showing up unannounced with something small wrapped in a dish towel, a few rolls, some fruit, sometimes just crackers, and she'd sit on the edge of my bed and tell me that hunger was a feeling, not a fact, and feelings pass if you give them something to do. She'd say it in a way that made it sound like she'd survived 100 worse nights and come out fine on the other side, which, knowing her, she probably had. I think that's where the want came from. Not some inspiring origin story about passion or destiny. Just a flat, practical decision I made somewhere around 13 years old that I was never going to do that math again. I was never going to lie in bed wondering if there'd be enough. By the time I was 15, I had already tried half a dozen small ways to make money. Babysitting, mowing lawns, reselling things I found at yard sales for a few dollars more online. None of it added up to anything that mattered. What changed things was a girl 2 years ahead of me in school named Jenna, who was obsessed with social media marketing before most adults even understood what that meant. Jenna's older cousin ran small ad campaigns for local businesses, and Jenna used to sit in on his calls and take these incredibly detailed notes. Audience targeting, ad spend pacing, what made people stop scrolling versus what made them click. She wasn't using any of it for herself. She just liked learning it, the way some people like memorizing trivia. One afternoon, bored after school, she let me read through an entire notebook of it while we waited for her mom to pick us up. I didn't understand half of it, but what I did understand stuck immediately. The idea that you could put a small amount of money behind the right words and the right image, aimed at the right exact group of people, and get back more than you put in, that idea rearranged something in my head. It felt like someone had handed me a cheat code to the one thing my family had never had enough of. I started copying her notes by hand into my own notebook. I added to them. I started running tiny test ads for a neighbor's dog walking business using $10 of my own babysitting money, just to see if the numbers actually behaved the way Jenna's note said they would. They did. Not perfectly, but enough to make my hands shake a little the first time I saw a stranger's comment asking how to book. Knowing the theory wasn't the same as understanding how a business actually survived day to day, though. For that, I needed to be inside one. So at 16, I lied about my age slightly and got hired as a dishwasher and general cleanup hand at a hotel a few towns over called the Crestview. It wasn't glamorous. I came home most nights smelling like grease and industrial dish soap, my hands cracked from the hot water, my back aching in a way 16-year-olds aren't supposed to feel. But I asked questions, constantly. I'd corner the events coordinator during slow shifts and ask why she priced certain packages the way she did. I'd watch the front desk manager handle an angry guest and study exactly which words calmed the situation down and which ones made it worse. I learned what margins meant by literally watching food cost percentages get calculated on a clipboard taped inside the kitchen door. Nobody was teaching me on purpose. I was just paying attention in a place most people my age were trying to get through as fast as possible. That hotel ended up teaching me more about how a real business actually operates than any textbook would have. But it also gave me one of the most humiliating nights of my entire life, and I think about it more than I'd like to. There was a private event at the Crestview one Friday night, a birthday party for a girl in my graduating class named Madison, who came from money the way some people come from old furniture. Like it had just always been there and would always be there. Half my class was invited. I wasn't, not really, but a few people had mentioned it in passing, like it was the place to be that weekend. When one of the girls in my friend group asked if I was going, I said I couldn't, that I had to watch my grandmother that night. It wasn't even a fully calculated lie. It just came out easier than saying I'd be at the Crestview that night with rubber gloves up to my elbows. Except the Crestview was exactly where Madison's party was being held. I spent most of the night in the back, hoping the kitchen doors stayed shut. They didn't. Around 11, I got sent out to clear glasses from a side table near the dance floor, still in my uniform, hairnet and all, and I walked directly into a circle of my own classmates. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds before someone laughed. Not everyone, but enough. One guy I barely knew, Tyler, said something like, "Wait, isn't this the girl who had to watch her grandma tonight?" loud enough for a small cluster of people to hear, and the laugh that followed wasn't cruel exactly, but it didn't need to be cruel to hurt. It was the kind of laugh that makes you feel very small and very seen at the same time, in the worst possible way. I remember my face burning, my hands gripping the tray so hard the glasses rattled, and for a second I genuinely thought about quitting on the spot and walking out the back door and never coming back. But there was also another reaction happening at the same table, quieter, that I didn't notice until later. A girl named Priya, who I wasn't even particularly close with at the time, came and found me in the kitchen hallway afterward. She told me working a real job at 16 was more impressive than anything happening at that party, and she meant it in a way that didn't feel like pity. She said most of the people laughing had never paid for anything in their life with money they'd earned themselves, and that someday that gap between us was going to matter a lot more than it did tonight. I didn't fully believe her in the moment. I was still too embarrassed to believe anything except that I wanted to disappear. But I went home that night and cried in a way I hadn't in years, the kind of crying that comes less from the moment itself and more from everything underneath it finally cracking open. My grandmother was still awake when I got home, sitting in her usual chair with the television barely on, and she didn't ask what happened right away. She just let me sit next to her until I was ready to talk. When I finally told her, she didn't tell me the kids were wrong to laugh, which I appreciated, because it would have felt like a lie. Instead, she said something I've never forgotten. She said shame only survives in silence, and the fastest way to kill it is to use it for something. She told me to take whatever I was feeling that night and turn it into fuel instead of evidence. I didn't transform overnight into some unstoppable force after that conversation. I still flinched every time Tyler's name came up at school for the rest of the year. But something did shift. I stopped being embarrassed about working. I started being almost defiant about it, telling people exactly where I worked when they asked, instead of dodging the question, daring them to make something of it. By the time I turned 18, I had saved up a small amount of money, a mix of hotel paychecks, and the little marketing experiments I kept running on the side for local businesses who were willing to pay a teenager $50 to manage their social ads because nobody else would do it for that price. It wasn't much, but it was enough to register an actual business, the one that needed my father's name on the paperwork, because the bank wouldn't take mine seriously. I called it Lighthouse Digital. The name was sentimental more than strategic. Something about the idea of a small business in the dark needing one steady light to find its way through felt right to me at the time, probably because of all those years feeling like my own family was navigating in the dark looking for any kind of guidance. The first year was brutal in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. I ran the entire thing alone out of a corner of my parents' garage, building ad campaigns for local restaurants, salons, and contractors who were desperate for customers and had no idea how to use the internet to find them. I underpriced everything because I had no leverage to ask for more. Most months, after paying for ad spend on behalf of clients and the basic software tools I needed, there was almost nothing left over for me. There was one stretch, close to the 1-year mark, where a client's campaign needed an emergency budget boost to hit a deadline they'd been promised, and I didn't have the cash sitting separately from what I needed for groceries. I remember standing in the kitchen doing math on a piece of paper, and the only way the numbers worked was if I didn't eat for the next 2 days and put that grocery money straight into the ad account instead. So that's what I did. I told my parents I'd already eaten at a friend's house both times they asked, the same kind of lie I'd watched them tell Sarah and me years earlier, except now I understood exactly why they'd said it. The campaign hit its numbers. The client renewed for triple the original budget the following month. I remember sitting on the garage floor that night, lightheaded and proud at the same time, thinking that this, finally, was the start of something that couldn't be taken away. I want to pause here and say something because if you've ever built anything from absolutely nothing, you already know exactly where this story is headed, and it's going to make your blood boil a little. But stay with me because the part that hurts the most isn't even the part you're expecting yet. Lighthouse Digital grew slowly and then suddenly, the way most real businesses do. By year 3, I had 2 employees. By year 5, I had an actual office, 12 people on payroll, and a client roster that included a few names you'd recognize if you lived in the area. We weren't some Silicon Valley unicorn. We were a steady, profitable, well-run regional company, and to me, that was everything. I had built something real out of rice portions and dishwashing shifts and 2 days without food, and it was mine. Or at least, that's what I believed, in the part of my brain that hadn't yet thought too hard about whose name was actually on the company documents. Things were genuinely good during that stretch. We were profitable every quarter. Clients referred other clients without us asking. I finally moved out of my parents' house into a small apartment close to the office, and for the first time in my life, I didn't think about money the way I used to. I'd walk into a grocery store and just buy what I wanted instead of calculating it first. It sounds small, but if you grew up the way I did, you understand exactly how big that feeling actually is. My relationship with my parents during this time was warm, at least on the surface. They were proud of me, or said they were, the way parents say things at family gatherings to relatives who ask what their kids are up to. My company became their easy answer to that question. What they didn't say as often, or maybe didn't even consciously notice themselves, was a quieter undertone that had existed in our house for years. That Sarah was the child who was supposed to do something impressive, and I was the child who was just supposed to be helpful. I never let myself get eaten up by that. I want to be honest about that part instead of pretending I was some perfectly evolved person who felt nothing. I noticed it. Of course I noticed it. But I also genuinely didn't want to spend my limited energy resenting my sister for something that wasn't really her fault. She didn't ask to be favored any more than I asked to be the responsible one. I was the kid who paid bills and fixed problems. She was the kid who got praised for existing well. Both of those roles get assigned to you before you're old enough to have a say in it. Sarah went off to a well-known business school a few hours away, the kind of school that costs more in a single semester than my entire first year of running Lighthouse Digital had made in profit. My parents found a way to pay for it that they never fully explained to me, and I never asked too many questions, partly because some part of me suspected I wouldn't like the answer, and partly because I told myself it didn't matter. I had my company. Sarah had her degree. We were on different paths, and that was fine. When Sarah graduated, my parents threw her a party that genuinely looked more like a wedding than a graduation. Family members flew in. There was a banner. My mother cried during the toast in a way she had never cried at any of my own business milestones. Not when I signed my first major client, not when I hit my first 6 figures in annual revenue, not when I hired my first full-time employee. I noticed that too. I told myself it didn't matter. Almost immediately after the party, the conversation started. My parents began floating the idea, gently at first, that Sarah should come work at Lighthouse Digital. They framed it as an obvious next step. She had the formal business education I never got, and surely she could bring something valuable to the company I'd already built. I remember my father saying it almost as if it was a gift to me, like he was handing me a resource instead of a complication. At first, I welcomed it. I want to be clear about that, because it's important for what comes later. I wasn't secretly dreading her arrival or bracing for betrayal from day one. I genuinely liked the idea of having family around, especially after years of building everything completely alone. Sarah had some real strengths, too. She understood formal financial modeling better than I did. She could speak the language investors and bigger partners used in a way that made us look more sophisticated in meetings. For the first few months, I made a point of including her in everything, walking her through every account, every client relationship, every internal process I'd built by trial and error over 5 years. I kept my head down during that stretch, focused entirely on making the integration smooth. I didn't comment when she questioned a process I'd spent years refining. I didn't push back hard when she suggested changes to things that were already working fine, because I wanted to give her room to find her footing instead of making her feel like an outsider in her own family's business. I told myself that was generosity. Looking back, some of it was generosity, and some of it was me quietly hoping that if I was patient enough, the part of me that still wanted my parents' approval might finally get it through her. But things shifted faster than I expected, and the shift wasn't loud. It was small decisions made slightly outside my knowledge at first. A client contract she adjusted without looping me in, telling me afterward instead of before. A pricing change she rolled out to a segment of accounts because she felt it modeled better without running it past me first. Individually, none of it looked like a power grab. Collectively, it started to feel like she was quietly testing how far she could go before anyone stopped her. I don't think Sarah woke up one morning and decided to take my company from me. I think it was simpler and uglier than that. I think some part of her had spent years watching me get treated as the responsible, unremarkable sibling, and her get treated as the gifted one. And somewhere along the way, she'd absorbed the idea that being gifted meant she was owed more authority than the situation actually gave her. I think she wanted to prove, maybe to our parents, maybe to her old classmates, maybe to herself, that the business degree meant something real, that she wasn't just the favored child. She was also the capable one. Whatever the reason, she was charming about it in a way that made it almost impossible to push back without looking petty. Sarah had this gift, even as a kid, of making people feel like being agreed with by her was a kind of honor. In meetings, she'd lean toward whoever she was talking to, repeat their idea back to them slightly improved, and somehow leave them feeling smarter for having said it in the first place. It worked on clients, it worked on vendors, and slowly it started working on my own team. I remember the exact week I realized something had fundamentally changed. We had a senior account manager named Derek, who'd been with me since year 2, someone I trusted completely, someone who used to run every major decision by me first out of habit. That week, I found out he'd already finalized a renewal contract with one of our biggest clients based on terms Sarah had approved, terms that were actually slightly worse for us financially than what I would have negotiated. When I asked him why he hadn't run it by me, he said, almost apologetically, but also almost defensively, that Sarah told him it was fine, and he assumed, since she'd looked at the numbers with her finance background, it had already been handled correctly. It wasn't one moment like that. It was a pattern that kept repeating in slightly different shapes. People started saying things like, "Oh, Sarah already looked at that," or "Sarah said she'd run it by you," except she hadn't, or she'd run a watered-down version by me that left out the part that mattered. My team started defaulting to her on operational questions even when I was sitting in the same room, not out of disrespect exactly, more because she made herself feel like the more comfortable, more agreeable option. I built the company they worked for, but she was the one who made them feel good while doing it. Around the same time, our office manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd worked alongside me since almost the very beginning, started routing simple operational questions to Sarah instead of me. Things as small as which vendor to use for printing or whether we should renew a software subscription. When I asked her about it directly, she said Sarah had mentioned wanting to be looped in on, in her words, the day-to-day texture of the business, and Patricia hadn't seen the harm in it. She said it so casually, like it was a small courtesy extended to a curious new hire, not a quiet redistribution of authority happening right under my nose. I remember standing in the hallway afterward, feeling like I'd just watched a brick get pulled out of a wall I'd built myself. One nobody else seemed to notice was now slightly less stable. There's a specific kind of helplessness that comes from watching control slip away in increments too small to point at individually. If she'd done one big obvious thing, I could have shut it down immediately and had every right to. Instead, it was death by 1,000 tiny, defensible decisions, each one easy enough to explain away on its own, impossible to fight as a pattern without sounding paranoid. I started bringing it up gently with my parents during this period, mentioning that Sarah was making calls outside her lane, and they brushed it off as growing pains, as Sarah finding her footing, as me maybe being a little too controlling about a company that, in their words, could probably benefit from a more modern perspective anyway. That phrase stuck with me, a more modern perspective, as if everything I'd built with no money, no degree, and no safety net for 5 years straight had somehow become outdated the moment someone with a diploma walked into the building. If you've ever watched someone slowly get replaced in their own life while everyone around them insists nothing is happening, you already know how isolating that particular kind of stress is. I started losing sleep, not the productive kind of exhaustion I'd felt in the early years building the company from the garage. This was different, heavier, the kind that comes from fighting a battle you're not even allowed to officially call a battle. The night everything became unmistakably clear was a Sunday family dinner, the kind we'd had 100 times before. Nothing unusual about the setup. My mother had made her usual roast. My father was talking about something happening at his job. Sarah seemed slightly too pleased with herself in a way I should have read more carefully than I did. About halfway through dinner, my father set down his fork in a way that made the table go quiet, the kind of small physical gesture that signals a rehearsed announcement is coming. He said he and my mother had been talking, and they felt it was time for a change in leadership at Lighthouse Digital. He said Sarah had the formal training, the modern instincts, and the vision to take the company into its next chapter, and they thought it made sense for her to step into a leadership role going forward. I sat there for a few seconds without saying anything. Not because I was speechless in the dramatic sense people imagine in moments like this. I was calm, almost unnervingly calm, because some part of me had already half expected this exact conversation for weeks. I'd watched the pattern build for too long not to see where it was heading. The only surprise was how casually they delivered it, like they were discussing a seating change at a wedding instead of asking me to hand over 5 years of my life to someone who hadn't been there for any of the parts that actually built it. I asked them fairly evenly what exactly they meant by leadership role. My father said they pictured Sarah taking over as CEO, with me staying involved in some capacity. Maybe operations, maybe a senior advisory position, something that used my experience without putting me at the top of the org chart anymore. I looked at Sarah while he said this. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look uncomfortable either. She had the calm, settled expression of someone who already knew exactly how this dinner was going to go, because she'd had the real conversation with our parents days or weeks before I was ever included in it. I told them, as steadily as I could manage, that this was my company, that I built it from nothing, with no help, with no degree, with no cosigner except the bare legal minimum required to open a bank account, and that I wasn't interested in being demoted inside the thing I created so my sister could have a title to match her diploma. My mother said I was being defensive instead of practical. My father said the company had grown beyond what one person could realistically run alone anymore, and that bringing in someone with formal training wasn't a betrayal, it was just smart business. I tried to reason with them as the conversation went on, laying out specifics, pointing to the contract that had been quietly weakened, the renewal Sarah approved without me, the pattern of decisions made around me instead of with me. They listened or pretended to, and then circled back to the same conclusion every time. They believed Sarah was the future of the company. They wanted me to step aside gracefully for the good of everyone, including, they said, myself. Hurt doesn't really cover what that felt like. It was something closer to watching the floor of your entire identity get pulled out from underneath you by the two people who were supposed to be the most solid ground you had. I realized, sitting at that table, looking at my mother's calm face, and my father's reasonable tone, and my sister's quiet, practiced composure, that I couldn't let this happen. Not because of pride, although there was plenty of that too, but because I understood with total clarity that nothing about this had ever been about what was best for the company. It was about who they decided deserved to be seen as impressive. The cruelest part wasn't even the decision itself. It was how calm they all were while delivering it. Like they'd rehearsed exactly how this would go and were mildly disappointed. I wasn't taking it as gracefully as they'd hoped. I stayed quiet through most of it after that initial round of arguing, partly because I was too overwhelmed to keep fighting in real time, and partly because some colder, more practical part of my brain had already started working on something else entirely. I also want to mention something that made that dinner even harder to sit through. By that point, most of my own team back at the office had already started leaning towards Sarah in the small ways I described earlier. If word of this leadership change reached them the way my parents were framing it, I had no real reason to believe they'd push back on my behalf. If anything, based on how things had been trending for months, I suspected several of them would treat my removal as a relief, one less obstacle standing between them and whatever easier, more flattering version of working life Sarah seemed to offer. Because legally, on paper, none of it was actually mine to fight for in the first place. The company was registered under my father's name. Every contract, every business account, every legal document that mattered had his signature on it, not mine. I had built every single piece of Lighthouse Digital with my own hands, my own decisions, my own exhaustion. But in the eyes of any court, any bank, any official record, I had no enforceable claim to any of it. That single fact, the one I'd let slide for years out of trust and discomfort, and the simple desire not to make things complicated with people I loved, had quietly become the most expensive blind spot of my entire adult life. I drove home from that dinner without turning the radio on, which for me is unusual, because silence in a car usually makes me anxious. That night I didn't want noise. I wanted to think clearly, without distraction, for the first time in months. I stopped by my grandmother's house on the way back, even though it was already late. She was still awake, like she usually was on the nights that mattered most, sitting in her chair with the lamp on low. I told her everything, the leadership announcement, the pattern with my team, the legal reality I'd ignored for too long. She listened without interrupting, the way she always had, letting me get all the way through it before she said anything at all. When she finally spoke, she didn't try to comfort me with anything soft. She asked me a single question. She asked what I actually wanted, not what I wish my parents had said, not what would feel fair, but what I specifically wanted to happen next. I sat there for a long moment before answering, and the answer that came out surprised even me a little, because it wasn't about getting the title back or proving my parents wrong or punishing Sarah. What I actually wanted was simple. I wanted to build something that was completely, undeniably mine, where no signature but my own decided whether I stayed or left. My grandmother nodded slowly, like that was the answer she'd been waiting for me to arrive at on my own. She told me something I've held on to ever since. She said, the people who raised you don't automatically know you better than you know yourself, and loving someone doesn't obligate you to keep handing them the parts of your life you built without them. I grew up more in that one night than I had in the previous 2 years of running an actual company. Something in me went quiet and clear, the kind of clarity that only shows up after you stop hoping someone is going to be reasonable and start planning around the fact that they aren't going to be. Over the next several weeks, I started moving carefully and deliberately without telling anyone outside a very small circle what I was actually doing. I knew the company inside and out, every contract renewal date, every client relationship that depended more on personal trust in me than on any official Lighthouse Digital branding, every vulnerability, in how loosely things had been structured, because I'd built most of it myself with no outside oversight. I reached out quietly to our three largest clients, the ones whose contracts were coming up for renewal in the next quarter anyway, and had honest, careful conversations with each of them. I didn't trash Sarah or my parents in those conversations, even though every part of me wanted to. I simply told them I was transitioning into a new venture and asked if they'd be willing to follow the work instead of the company name once the timing was right. Every single one of them said yes almost immediately, which told me saying something important about whose relationships had actually been carrying the business all along. I had similar conversations with the 4 employees who had stayed loyal to me throughout the entire mess with Sarah, the ones who hadn't quietly drifted toward her side of every disagreement. I didn't ask them to do anything unethical or breach any contracts. I simply let them know my plans honestly and asked if they'd want to come build something new with me when the time came. All 4 said yes without hesitation, and one of them, a project lead named Marcus, told me he'd actually been waiting for me to say something for weeks because he'd noticed the same shift in the office that I had and didn't know how to bring it up. I registered a new entity, quietly, under my own name this time, no co-signer required, because by then I had years of personal credit history and enough saved capital to do it cleanly. I called it Meridian Digital. I picked the name partly because it sounded sharp and modern, and partly because a meridian marks a clean, exact line, the kind of clear boundary I hadn't had the courage to draw with my own family until that point. While I was doing all of this, I also kept showing up at Lighthouse Digital every single day, doing my job the same way I always had, holding the company together through what was actually becoming a fairly chaotic transition period as Sarah settled into more visible authority. There's a strange, exhausting irony in working incredibly hard to maintain something you've already decided to leave. I found myself shouting, gently but firmly, at employees who were slacking off in the confusion of the leadership shift. I found myself stepping in personally to make sure Sarah didn't make any decisions involving client funds that could blow up before I was ready to leave. Not because I still wanted to protect the company for its own sake, but because I needed it to look stable for just a little while longer while I finished preparing my exit. Looking back, I think a part of me was still holding the whole thing together out of old habit, the same instinct that had me managing every detail since I was 19 years old. Another part of me, the more honest part, was holding it together because some old wound in me still wanted to prove to Sarah's old college crowd, to my parents, to anyone who'd ever doubted me, that I wasn't the small deal they'd quietly decided I was. I wasn't ready yet to admit that none of that should have mattered nearly as much as it did. I knew, even then, exactly what was wrong with how the company was being run under the new arrangement. I knew which clients were being mishandled, which processes Sarah had loosened that were going to cause real problems within a year, which of my old systems she'd dismissed as outdated without understanding why they existed in the first place. I wasn't interested in staying around to watch it collapse slowly while wearing a title that no longer meant what it used to. I knew I could build something better, leaner, smarter, somewhere nobody could vote me out of my own creation with a casual announcement over dinner. The night before I finally resigned, I slept better than I had in over a year. Not because I'd resolved any of the pain with my parents, that part hadn't gone anywhere, but because for the first time in months, I wasn't lying awake, calculating how to survive inside a structure that no longer wanted me at the top of it. I had a plan, a real one, with real people already committed to it, and that certainty let my body finally rest in a way stress had been blocking for far too long. The morning I resigned, I scheduled the meeting like any other, told the office it was a quick operational update, and walked into the small conference room where Sarah and my parents happened to be present, going over what I now know were early plans for restructuring my old role into something smaller and more decorative. I told them plainly that I was resigning, effective that day. I watched my mother's face shift from confusion to something closer to alarm as I continued, explaining that I had already started a new company, that our three largest clients had already agreed to transition their work over, and that several key team members would be joining me within the week. My father asked, almost in disbelief, how long I'd been planning this. I told him exactly as long as it had taken me to realize they'd already made their decision the night of that family dinner, and that I'd simply made mine in response. Sarah's expression was the one I remember most clearly. Not panic exactly, at least not yet. More like genuine surprise that I'd had it in me to act instead of just absorbing the situation the way I always had before. I think some small part of her has assumed I would eventually accept the new arrangement quietly, the way I'd absorbed so many smaller slights over the years for the sake of keeping peace in the family. They were shocked. They were furious, especially once the full scope became clear over the following days, once they realized guides exactly which contracts were not renewing, exactly which employees had already handed in their notice, exactly how much of what had made Lighthouse Digital valuable had quietly walked out the door with me weeks before I ever said a single word about leaving. But there was nothing left for them to do. The groundwork had been laid too carefully, too far in advance, for any last-minute scramble to undo it. I won't pretend that leaving felt purely triumphant in the moment, because it didn't. I had given that company every ounce of effort I had for 5 years. I'd cried over it more times than I'd ever admit out loud at the time. Alone in my car after hard days, alone in the bathroom at the office after particularly brutal client calls, alone on the floor of my apartment more than once, when the stress of running something that constantly demanded everything from me finally caught up. I'd built it for someone who, in the end, decided someone else deserved to hold it instead. Walking away from that wasn't simple, even when it was necessary. My grandmother was the one who held that part of it for me, the part that wasn't strategy or business logic, just grief. The night after I resigned, I went straight to her house instead of home, the same way I had after that dinner months earlier. She didn't ask how the meeting went right away. She just made tea, sat across from me, and waited until I was ready. When I finally talked, it wasn't about strategy or contracts or any of the practical mechanics of the transition. It was just about how much I'd given that company, how much of myself I'd poured into something that had never legally been mine to begin with. How strange it felt to grieve a thing I had voluntarily walked away from. She let me cry without rushing me through it, the same way she always had. And when I was finally done, she told me something simple. She said building something is never wasted, even when the wrong people end up holding it for a while. Because what you learned building it walks out the door with you no matter what. The first few months of Meridian Digital were, honestly, easier in some ways than the first few months of Lighthouse Digital had ever been, because this time I wasn't starting from zero. I had relationships, experience, a team that had chosen to follow me on purpose instead of inheriting me by default, and a much clearer sense of exactly which systems and processes actually worked, because I'd already lived through 5 years of figuring that out the hard way. We grew fast, faster than Lighthouse Digital ever had in its early years. Within the first year, Meridian had already surpassed Lighthouse's revenue from the year before I left. And within 2 years, we'd become one of the most recognized names in the regional digital marketing space, the exact niche Lighthouse Digital used to dominate. Lighthouse, meanwhile, started showing cracks almost immediately. Without the clients who'd followed me, without the employees who actually understood how the internal systems were built, Sarah was left holding a company shaped around processes she didn't fully understand and relationships she hadn't actually built herself. She brought in new hires to replace the ones who'd left, but new hires take time to ramp up, and clients don't wait patiently while a company finds its footing again. Within the first year under her leadership, Lighthouse lost 2 more major accounts on top of the ones that had already followed me out the door. I tried for a long while, not to track what was happening over there too closely. Partly out of self-preservation, partly because watching it felt uncomfortably close to the satisfaction I knew I wasn't supposed to be chasing. But word travels fast in a small regional industry, and I heard things anyway, through old contacts, through industry events, through the kind of secondhand information that finds you whether you go looking for it or not. By year 3 after I left, Lighthouse Digital had downsized from 12 employees to 4. By year 5, they'd lost their physical office and were operating out of a much smaller shared space. My parents stopped bringing up the company at family gatherings the way they used to. The same easy conversational topic from years earlier, quietly disappearing from the dinner table, the way uncomfortable subjects often do in families that prefer avoidance over honesty. I didn't reach out during any of this. Not out of cruelty, although I understand if it sounds that way from the outside. I genuinely didn't know what I would even say. Congratulations didn't fit. I told you so felt cheap and beneath what I actually wanted out of the relationship with my family going forward, if there was even going to be one. So I just kept building Meridian, kept showing up for my team, kept having dinner with my grandmother on Sundays instead of the family dinners I used to dread, and let time do whatever it was going to do on its own. It's been roughly 7 years since the night of that resignation. 7 years of Meridian, growing into easily the most respected name in our market, with a client list and a team 3 times the size of anything Lighthouse Digital ever managed, even at its peak. 7 years of watching, from a careful distance, as the company I once built from a garage slowly shrank into something barely recognizable. A few months ago, I got a call I genuinely wasn't expecting. It was Sarah, and I almost didn't pick up, because we hadn't spoken directly in years beyond brief, stiff exchanges at the handful of family events I still attended for our parents' sake. When I did answer, her voice sounded nothing like the confident, charming tone I remembered from the worst stretch of our shared history. It sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with a bad night's sleep. She asked if she could come see me, in person, not over the phone. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, though some old, complicated part of me also wanted to see for myself what 7 years had actually done. She showed up at my office a few days later, looking smaller than I remembered, not physically exactly, but in the way someone carries themselves when the armor they used to wear has worn thin. She sat across from my desk, the same desk in an office she'd never set foot in before, and after a long, uncomfortable silence, she told me Lighthouse Digital was filing for bankruptcy within the month. She told me the rest in pieces, the way people tell you painful things when they're not sure how much you actually want to hear. The remaining clients had finally left after a major account discovered a billing error that had been sitting unnoticed for months. The last 2 employees had quit within the same week, taking what institutional knowledge remained with them. My parents had quietly put money into the company twice over the past few years, trying to keep it afloat, money they genuinely couldn't afford to lose, money that was now gone along with everything else. Then she started crying in a way I'd genuinely never seen her cry before. Not the controlled, presentable kind of crying she used to do in front of our parents when she wanted sympathy, but something rawer and more exhausted, like 7 years of pretending things were fine had finally run completely out of road. She apologized, not in the vague, deflecting way people sometimes apologize when they're cornered, but specifically, painfully, going through it piece by piece. She apologized for going around me on decisions instead of with me. She apologized for letting our parents push for the leadership change without ever once standing up and saying it wasn't right. She said she'd spent years telling herself she deserved that position because of her degree, and it had taken losing absolutely everything to finally admit she'd never actually built anything. She'd only taken something someone else had already built and assumed that was the same thing. I sat there for a long moment before responding, partly because I genuinely didn't know what I wanted to say, And partly because some old instinct in me was bracing for this to be another version of the same charm that had worked on my team all those years ago. But watching her, I didn't see that same calculated softness. I saw someone who had genuinely run out of options and pride at the exact same time. I told her I wasn't going to pretend the last 7 years hadn't happened, and I wasn't going to pretend I'd fully forgiven everything in the span of one conversation in my office. But I also told her something I hadn't expected to mean as much as it did once I said it out loud. I told her that, strange as it sounded, what she and our parents did had ended up making me stronger, sharper, and far more capable than I ever would have become if I'd just stayed comfortable inside a company I never actually controlled. 7 years of struggling on her end and 7 years of growing on mine felt like more than enough punishment and more than enough payoff, in equal, almost ironic measure. I didn't say all of that to make her feel better. I said it because it was true, and because holding on to the anger any longer wasn't going to give me anything I didn't already have, she asked quietly, almost like she didn't expect a real answer, whether I thought our parents had ever understood what they'd actually done. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that some people only understand the size of a mistake once the consequences finish landing, and that maybe this, all of it, the bankruptcy, the empty office, the calls she now had to make instead of receive, was simply what understanding looked like for our family, late and expensive and impossible to undo. She nodded slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand the way she used to when we were kids and didn't want anyone to know she'd been crying. And for a second, I saw the sister I'd grown up with, instead of the version who'd spent years convincing herself a title was the same thing as having actually earned something. What I did next surprised even me a little, though looking back, I think some part of me had been quietly preparing for exactly this option for longer than I realized. Meridian had grown large enough by that point to acquire smaller regional firms when it made strategic sense, and I'd actually looked at 2 or 3 over the past year without committing to anything. I told Sarah I'd be willing to acquire what remained of Lighthouse Digital, absorb its few existing obligations, and bring on the handful of employees who wanted to stay through the transition, but only under Meridian's name, Meridian's structure, and my decisions, with no leadership title attached to her name unless she earned it the same way everyone else in my company had to. She agreed almost immediately, with none of the old negotiating instinct she used to bring into every conversation. I think she understood, finally, that this wasn't an opportunity to angle for a better position. It was a door being held open by someone who genuinely didn't have to hold it open at all. The paperwork finalized about 6 weeks ago. Lighthouse Digital, the company I built out of nothing starting at 19 years old, the company my parents handed to my sister over a Sunday dinner, technically doesn't exist anymore as its own entity. What's left of it now operates as a small division inside Meridian Digital, the company that exists entirely because of that betrayal. Built on the exact foundation, Lighthouse Digital lost the moment they decided I wasn't the one who deserved to keep it. My parents and I are speaking again, Karef,